Hey, everybody, welcome back to a new episode of the Hemmings Hot Rod BBQ podcast. On this episode, we've got Eddie Alterman on the show. Now, Eddie is the Chief Brand Officer for Hearst Autos, overseeing Car and Driver, Road and Track, Auto Week, as well as other stuff. Eddie is one of the OGs of the industry. He's been doing this a long time. He's probably forgotten more than I will ever know, which is pretty impressive. And then we also have Hemmings' own Mike Austin, who's a frequent guest on the show, and Mike's the same way. Mike's been doing this a long time too. Super knowledgeable, very, very good panel. I'm probably the lowest link on the totem pole here, which is totally fine. Eddie, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Mike. It's really great to be with you, and I'm a huge fan. I've admired everything you've done since you got into this business, and you know I love your passion and authority, and it's a great voice.
Thank you. Well, I find that if you could say anything with authority, most of the time people will believe it, right? So it's just, I figure it's all in the delivery for the most part. So exactly. You've been doing this a long time, and you've got an amazing career story behind you. What I want to know is, how did you first get into this industry? What were you always an automobile fanatic? Is it something that you wanted to do since, like, were you like, okay, I just want to play with cars for the rest of my life? Like, how did you begin this?
Kind of came from my dad. This is how I learned to read. I learned to read reading Car and Driver, reading Brian Gates and David E. Davis and Pat Bedard and Larry Griffin and John Phillips a little bit later. And my dad used to leave open copies of Car and Driver on the dining room table for me to read before I went to school. And I looked at what those guys were doing, where they were traveling, the cars they were driving, and I was like, I want to do this. And it's sort of like, the fact that I got to do it, that I got to be the editor-in-chief of Car and Driver, is insane to me. It's like wanting to be the quarterback of the Dallas Cowboys and getting to be the Dallas Cowboys quarterback. So that's a very weird thing. And I don't like to think about it too much because it creeps me out that I got this crazy opportunity and was able to do that job for 10 years. But I was just always super passionate, not just about cars, but about car magazines and car media. And I loved car media, and I loved, the writing that those people were doing, Gene Lindemood, obviously David. And when Automobile magazine came out in 1986, I was like, oh yeah, I want to work there. And that's why I went to the University of Michigan, because there were two car magazines there. Car and Driver and Automobile. Yeah, both were in Ann Arbor, and both because David E. moved Car and Driver in 1978 from One Park Avenue in New York City to Ann Arbor.
So you knew from when you were a kid that you wanted to go down this road straight out.
Yeah, it's kind of depressing, but that's kind of what I always wanted to do.
I think that's amazing. I didn't know I wanted to. I mean, I always knew I wanted to do it. I didn't know how to do it till I was in my, kind of my early 30s. So the fact that you had that vision right out of the gate is pretty amazing.
Well, I got super lucky, like back then there were 4 or 5 car magazines really like doing new car stuff. There was Carcraft and there was Hot Rod and there was some stuff on the West Coast, but I was in the middle of the country, and luckily, there were 2 of the big car mags were right at my doorstep. And so I got very, very lucky. I started working there while I was in college at 19, washing and gassing cars, occasionally crashing them, and somehow managed to survive that. And Mike Austin did the same job.
Well, so I was gonna say before the podcast started, Eddie was saying, I need to keep him honest, and what I was gonna do actually is stop you from being too humble, because, you had all that background, but Eddie went and got an English degree, and I don't know. To me, he's always been like this guy that is super well read, can pull references from everywhere, but to his point with that was the path. It was really funny. I started as a gopher when Eddie was at Automobile, and then I got my start when Eddie went to launch MPH magazine and brought me on there. But the gopher job is it's the dream job for a college kid. You go into the gas station to fill up cars, you go into the airport to drop them off for spoiled automotive journalists, and and every time you get there, there's this like, it's almost like hazing, because they're like, this isn't a way in. We don't want you to do this job. This is just a job for you to have while you go to college and get your
Right.
degree and get out of here. And yet there's this incredible roster of people that is like, well, that guy works here, right? Can't I do that? And so the people that were stubborn enough to stick around and, you know, showed some kind of promise eventually made it in. So
It was
it
like
was
the
a pretty
mail,
good system though.
it was like the mailroom at CAA, right? You know,
Oh God.
that's how you learn the business. Like washing
That's
and
right.
gassing cars, all the car movements, what had to be where, when, how stories happened, working with
Oh, yeah.
photographers. And it was great. It was so much fun. And I just loved every minute of it. And even took an extra year of school so that I could stay working there. And yeah, I mean, it was like kind of a rare time. And like Mike was saying, the access was very limited. You know, you if you wanted to write about cars, there were only a few places to do it. There was no
Right.
internet. I think
Right.
the first car, to Mike's point about driving cool stuff, I think the first car I ever got in was a 1992 FDRX7.
Huh, okay.
And I'm 19 years old.
That's rad, dude. That's very rad.
And then 964 Carrera that had a Tiptronic. Do you remember that car, Mike? That periwinkle, Mike? That car? I don't know. That may have been before you, but that Tiptronic system allowed you to downshift by blipping the throttle. Like if you left foot braked in that car and hit the throttle, it would downshift.
Really?
And that's what I would do like all afternoon, just drive that thing around.
Isn't it crazy? I mean, you know, you both talk about the, you know, being like the gopher and how to get into the industry. And it's an interesting thing. Like for me, and I grew up on the East Coast in New York City and Brooklyn and the island, and there wasn't any car magazines. There wasn't anything out there, right?
Yeah.
And the only way that I knew how to get in was I started working for an event services company, a company called ESI.
Yeah.
And so I worked for ESI doing just those jobs. And I did that on weekends while I was a internet designer for Citibank in Lower Manhattan.
Really?
Yeah. I was like, all right, I got to figure out a way to do this. And then I started, like you said, delivering cars to journalists. And again, I was in my 30s doing this. I wasn't 19. And so I was delivering cars to journalists that were you know, someone in the industry. And I was like, I want to be this guy. Like I want a Porsche delivered to my house. And how do I do this?
It's a secret world, right? And
it's
like,
crazy, right?
Nobody knew about it. And you know what? One of the guys that used to deliver cars to us was Dax Shepard, because his mom had owned a delivery service called Shows and Shoots that just did General Motors cars. So like Dax was in that world, and that's why he's so, I mean, he's hardcore car.
Sure.
Yeah. And so I mean, it's just a really funny little you know, inner sanctum. And we were, you know, to go from the outside just reading about these guys to like picking up their dry cleaning, I was like, I died and gone to heaven, you know.
So what was that like? What was that like when you realized in your head that, holy shit, I could do this. I could make this transition and possibly become one of, quote unquote, those guys?
Well, the great thing about automobile was it was very short staffed. So they kind of took you and threw you into shit. And you're like,
yeah,
maybe I can do this. I don't know. And, you know, it just kind of all worked. Isn't that kind of the case, Mike? Like they were just, you know, they were very open to having, you know, you come in.
Yeah, I mean, you hang around and you get to know it, and you know, you prove that you have you know, basic functioning adult capabilities, and then you just keep asking, and you know, like again, once you've been there a little bit, you see like, well, this is going to come around. They're going to need somebody to write, you know, this caption or something, and then
right,
you know, and then you kind of go through the crucible there, because it's like, again, this was print days, this was before internet. They had a month. You know, they had a whole month. You maybe wrote, if you wrote 2 things a month, you were like a pretty high producer. So, yeah, you know, you're the first thing you write at the editor, you probably rewrite it 3 or 4 times because the editor just rakes you over the coals. But it's honestly one of the best systems. Like, you know, I still have a stack of memos that, was sort of handed down through people, and you remember those lessons. It was, the writing really was a big part of it.
Yeah. It was so labor intensive to do those two pieces, and there were so many checks and balances, and there was so much work that went into those pages. It was really incredible. And the fact checking, I was a fact checker after I was a gopher for a while, and that's one of the great things I did in my career, to actually learn how a magazine came together.
Right.
And but the weirdest part was like going from idolizing guys like the late Phil Llewellyn, who I loved, and he was just so hilarious and so inappropriate at all the right times, and idolizing David E. Like David E. Davis was just a hero to my dad and a hero in our house, and was like one of the literary giants. Like I consider him really like the first participatory journalist. Like before George Plimpton, he was out there doing it,
right,
and racing and driving cars all over the world and bringing it to you and bringing these things to life. And then to go into like his office and talk to him and then go to lunch with him, I was like, I've died and gone to heaven. This is unbelievable. And we'd go on these trips, and everybody would be there, all of your rock stars from growing up. Like now you're in the band, like you're jamming with what is going on? This is crazy. And so I just got addicted to it and never left, but the business has changed so much from those pre-internet days. And that's what's exciting about it, is the speed of change has only accelerated. We're running faster than ever, and there are more cars than ever. There's more places to publish than ever, and it's just wild. But I'm glad I had those skills,
I would say too, one of the neat things, I guess I've come around to get comfortable with it, but when the internet came on, and when YouTube came on, and all these different channels, there's all this disruption. And I mean, I think it's even like probably a trope that, like the old grizzled, auto journalist is out of touch and doesn't like it.
The Journosaurus
doesn't know what to do with these kids. But again, like everyone is adjusted. We're living in that reality now. And the great part about it is it forces you to raise your game. It's like, look at what Doug DeMuro built. I guess like we got to play in video. You can't just pretend video doesn't exist.
That's right.
Exactly.
Right.
He figured that thing out. And, one of the kind of core philosophies that we had at Car and Driver was, new platforms are going to show up, at a dizzying rate.
Yeah.
And you have to figure out how you're going to show up there. And so, we had this philosophy that you have to tailor the content to the medium, and sometimes even the platform. Your core values stay the same, but the way you express them on podcast, the way you express them on video, the way you even express them in a desktop, digital environment has to be different. You have to be the same people and speak in the same way, but what you do there has to be different. And, back in sort of the earliest days of the, kind of digital proliferation, like a lot of people were just shoveling print stuff online, and you would never have the required frequency, to make a dent. You would just never be able to keep up. And so like at Car and Driver, we had a great guy running digital named Mike Duchesne, another Mike. And he was like, no, what we are on the digital, on web, on desktop web especially, is a research portal. And that's what we're going to be. We'll still speak with the Car and Driver voice, but it's really about, it's really about knowing the user and how they're interacting with the platform. And that's been like, for a media person, somebody who's really interested in it, it's like every day is like new and interesting, and you learn so much in this job. It's amazing.
Let me ask you, how did you, so, when sitting at kind of on the top rung, how do you vet people that are coming in? Right. Because here's the thing, like, I know when I started I basically started in video. I started in writing and then transferred over to video. And it took me a while to kind of find a voice. And my voice is a little different than most people's voice. I write with a much more emotional tone than anything else. And some people like it, some people don't.
But I think that's why you connect with people, because it's real.
You try to be, right? But how do you, when people come in and they say, Eddie, I really want to do this, how do you help them find their voice? Or do you find that when you read somebody's articles and you read their reviews, can you see what they're trying to say without them saying it? I don't know if I'm getting that across properly. Do you know what they're trying to say? And how do you mold them, so to speak?
Well, I think the best lesson I really learned about editing happened when I was freelancing at Men's Journal. So this happened when I was at Automobile. Bruce McCall, the great Bruce McCall, who's the illustrator, the New Yorker illustrator,
Mm-hmm.
he had this column in Men's Journal and he passed it to Jean Lindemood. And when Jean became the editor of Automobile, she's like, I can't do this anymore. Can you do it? So I picked up this column at Men's Journal, and those guys were incredible editors. And they would say, no, you just contradicted yourself here. You're writing for this wider audience of guys, and you have to tell a story. You have to bring it to life. You have to do stuff. And so instead of doing car reviews, they introduced this narrative element to my writing, and also a logical element to my writing that made me think of things a lot differently. But the most important thing that they did was let me fix shit. Instead of going in line by line and writing what they wanted it to say, they'd say, no, this doesn't make sense, or this is unclear. What the hell are you talking about? Send it back to me. And you would never make that mistake again, because you want to impress them. You want to keep that gig. And, that's the freelancer's life. And so I tried to apply that to my line editing at Car and Driver, and Mike, was a victim of it. How would you say it went?
I have one specific story I remember, which was the Subaru Brz.
Great story.
I wrote it and then looked at it, and it was the kind of thing. It was like, look, I could turn this in, but for whatever reason, I was like, I don't like it, and I just started over. Which sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Just depends on your process and how the revision goes. And the second one I thought was good, but wasn't quite there. But I got to hand it in, and then it goes through a couple steps, and it comes back with Eddie's, and it comes back, and it's just like, oh, this just got 2 or 3 times better. This just jumped up a level. And I was like, Eddie, what did you do here? Because I looked at it and I mean, there were maybe 2 or 3 sentences, and that was it. It was all it took. Because he's like, I just put the trunk in here, so it has a spine to carry all the elements that you had in there already. So that was it. It was a light touch, but to your point, Musto, understanding what the writer was going for, and literally just the polish. But
isn't that shocking how 1 or 2 lines from a different set of eyes can increase and refine your voice to the point that you're like, I never knew I could sound this good.
Right.
You know what I mean? That always fascinated me. I'll be the first to say it. I'm a shit editor. That's the last job I want. But I've always been enamored with editors that can come back and take your words and not necessarily rearrange them, but just give you better clarification on what you're trying to say as a writer, right? And
that extra set of eyes is so important for everybody. The best writers in the world need editors the most,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I was going to say the other, Eddie never did it. This is something I talk about with my other writer friends, is the back in the day stories was, and I don't think Eddie ever did this to me. If it did happen to me at Car and Driver, it was probably the managing editor, but sometimes you turn something in and then you just get back, fix this.
I got that. Yeah.
And then, but it's a similar thing where you're like, well, when you don't know what's wrong and you assume everything's wrong, that really makes you work on your writing.
Yeah, that's right.
Exactly.
That's right. But I let me ask you this. When did you find as a writer that you had an audience, that people were all of a sudden coming to you and being like, Alterman's rad. This is I understand his voice. I can relate to his voice. It's something that I look forward to on a weekly basis.
Well, thanks for saying that, Mike. You know, I just tried to copy PJ O'Rourke as much as I could. That's all I was trying to do, you know, just trying to throw some zingers in there where you didn't expect it, trying to ambush the reader a little bit, and, you know, try to think, you know, hard about what was happening with the car and try to bring it to life. And Mark Gillies, who, you know, Mike and I worked with, great driver, writer, editor, he always said, you got to put their butt in the seat. And he meant like, you have to make it impressionistic. You have to like make people feel like they're actually in the car. And it took a while for me to get there, because I just wanted to tell like off-color jokes the whole time.
Right.
But no, and you know, he was able to bring that out of me in a great way. And you know, I think it was, you know, when you get great reader feedback that encourages you to go down that road, you have to kind of sift it out. I think in the digital world, there's so much shade thrown.
Yeah.
But people who really care and read and for whom these stories are meaningful, they'll give you good feedback. And when you get encouragement from those people who are, you know, thoughtful and well-reasoned, it's great criticism. Yeah. and it propels you forward for sure. And in a way, it's kind of the best thing about, you know, the digital realm is that instantaneous feedback, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you can't hide that. That's the one thing I learned. Like when I remember one of the first videos that I ever did. Oh my God, did I get crucified? I mean, to the point where like my mom watched it and she read the comments and she called me and she's like, who is such and such, blah, 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 you know, 872 John from Ohio. And I'm like, I'm a 40-year-old man. I used to be. And I'm like, it doesn't, you know, but they are relentless. But I think that the thing about that is that it tells you what you're doing wrong really quick. And I think my whole thing was, I distinctly remember the next video. The first 3 minutes of the video were me saying, listen, I apparently screwed the first one up really, really bad. And y'all hated it because y'all told me I sucked. What do you want to see? How do you want to see cars? And the comments were transformed into a section of, we would love to see this. And it would be great if you did that. It would be great. And I've always found that if you can engage with your audience, whether you're on video, whether you're doing a podcast, or whether you're a writer, that it's the most, that and a quality editor are the two best tools I've ever had. Yeah, by far.
And you got to be open-minded and responsive to it. And you know, every time you step into like a new medium, it's hard. You don't know the kind of the rules. You don't have that the language, the vocabulary, whether it's visual or, you know, verbal. And so it takes a while to sort of ramp up and get up to speed. Like the pilot I did for the podcast, they're like, you're reading this like you're about to commit suicide. You know, you're reading it like, you know, you're depressed, you know, and you have to shape how you say things. There needs to be a cadence and a rhythm to it. And, you know, writing, I always think, is a lot about rhythm, but when you deliver it verbally and it's just your voice and maybe some sound effects, there is nowhere to hide. And you have to, it's voiceover stuff. I have a whole new respect for it. It's really incredible.
Well, so, and this is a question for both of you guys, as writers and as editors and guys that have been doing this for a long time. Did you ever think there was a point, because you've literally both written thousands upon thousands of articles and stories and things like that. Was there ever a point where you thought, I'm out of words?
No.
Like I'm out of words. I don't know what other descriptives I can use. I'm out of verbs. I'm out of adjectives. I'm you know what I mean?
You do. I guess you do feel sometimes like you get in a rut and you have to break through another wall. You know, I've felt that many times in my career. Like I need some more inspiration. But the great thing about writing about cars is there's always raw material. I've never had writer's block. I've procrastinated and I've been lazy. I've never had writer's block, you know, because like cars are exciting. There's so much cool shit to talk about, especially when you're dealing with like new technology. I mean, what do you think, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, I would say when it comes to the creative aspect, whether it's the descriptor or like figuring out a framework or a lead, anytime you feel like you're coming up short, I would either go read other car reviews of authors I liked, or just read other good writing. And in some ways you might borrow it in terms of the rhythm, but mostly it was just like that would get the gears turning in your brain.
Yeah.
And that's actually this is something I think about, because there was one time I had a subscription to Financial Times, and I was like, I got to stop reading Financial Times because it was leaking into what I was writing. It was just super dry,
bringing you down.
And it's the stuff you feed your brain in any form, but especially when you work in a creative practice, the stuff you feed your brain makes a difference, just like the stuff you eat.
Yeah. It's brain food, and you wind up emulating the rhythms. You wind up stealing words. I always felt like the New Yorker was my best friend. Like reading the New Yorker helped me structure stuff, helped me write stuff, helped me find new ways to say things, all within the context of like a narrative story. And that was a great influence on me, those New Yorker writers, because man, they were so elegant. And that's what I loved about the early days of Automobile and Car and Driver, is just the elegance of the prose and how funny it was. And like, you read Brock Yates and you're like, this guy, like,
it's amazing,
right?
Just amazing.
Like talking to your best friend. How did they do that?
Think so one of the things I found now, and I think it's because of the way the culture is going, is it's very, I think you could still have your own voice, but it's difficult. It's difficult. Like, I know that there are times that I'll write something or do something or say something, and I'll read it back. I'm like, that's amazing. But I can't let that out to the public. I'm going to get yelled at in 16 different ways. Right. And I think we all have those things. And you're like, but I know there's going to be at least 4 people out there that are going to find it hilarious. Right. And it's like, those are the people that I'm talking to. But I think that's getting more difficult.
I know. And I always think that you don't write for the lowest common denominator. You should write for the people who are going to get the jokes and are going to get the references. And, you got to aim high. But there is this huge commodification of words, and what Google wants is really important, and there's a certain structure to that.
I know.
And getting your voice through that is tough. It's very tough.
Yeah.
It's and we're all sort of we're all working for the platforms at this point. We're all
I think so. I mean, I know, going back to kind of the story aspect and putting the readers or the viewers' butts in the seats, right? It was interesting because when I was doing video and reviewing other people's cars, privately owned vehicles, right? I would always add, my first question to them was, how many miles have you driven the car in the last year? Right? Whether it was a newer car or an older muscle car, how many miles have you driven the last car in the year? And some people are like, I drove 200 miles last year. And I'm like, I drove 200 miles in the last 4 hours. So you're out because you have nothing to talk about. You're relying on shit that you've done 25 years ago. I don't care. Right. And then you would get the other person be like, I don't know, it was my 72 Monte Carlo. I drove it 16,000 miles last year and it's got rust all over it. I'm like, you come here and sit here for 4 hours. Right. And that was the guy, or that was the individual that I'm like,
he's seen some shit.
He sees some shit. You are my new, I used to call it bring a stranger to work day, because that's what we used to do, right? You'd bring this person that you never met and you'd spend anywhere between 8 to 16 hours with them. And it was fascinating, right? The things that they would let you know about this, whatever their vehicle was and how it pertained to them and helped them grow or whatever the case was. And it was always, the car is just the vessel for the story, right?
That's right.
The owner, the driver, the individual is what makes the story. The car just physically gets them to that place, or if it blows up, doesn't get them to that place, but the story still happens.
Yeah, the cars are important, but it's also like, the human story, the people are what sort of propel the thing forward. And it's like, I think about, Drive to Survive on Netflix and why that's so popular,
Yeah.
they are never talking about the cars.
No.
I mean, there's stuff in there like about pit strategy that like F1 heads will love, but mostly it's about the drivers and the team principles and those human stories. And that's what's so great, I think, about the hot rod magazines like CarCraft, where you're really like getting a person's story out there and what they did with that build and why it was so important to them. And you know, I think there's probably too little of that in,
without question,
you know, mainstream car reviews.
So and
this
go ahead, Mike.
Oh, this is what I was going to ask you then. You know, dealing with the new car world, you know, I don't think it's quite as grim as like most car enthusiasts say. You know, everything's boring and everything's a jelly bean. But there is a certain amount of like, there isn't as much of a story with the new cars, like, you know, say with the first Taurus or the new gen Taurus, you know, where there's like, here's a big deal. Now it's like, yeah, we made another model. This one's got a lower roof line. How do you approach that in the new car world with like finding those stories, or are the stories still there? Or
well, isn't that a weird like kind of dichotomy or disconnect that we're in the most convulsive time in our lives around in the automotive realm? Like, you know, we have a new prime mover technology maybe emerging. We have you know, driver assist that might evolve or get usurped by full self-driving. We've got all this new, a sort of a new landscape in terms of retail, you know, in terms of how we, you know, fill these things up. But at the same time, like cars feel so much less important than the bigger stories, than the big sort of social change that's happening. Like the interesting thing about Tesla is not the cars. I mean, they're kind of one-trick ponies in some ways. They're very, very quick in a straight line. But the amazing thing is kind of the human story and who Musk is and what he was able to do, and the ecosystem that he's built around those cars. So you've got this weird kind of paradox where, like there's no Taurus anymore. You know, there's no E30 M3 or anything like that. There's no 928, but everything feels very evolutionary. But that's probably a smart thing for the car makers to do, you know, and there's much more sharing of components. I mean, everything's got a ZF 8-speed, you know, and it's like, it feels like there aren't these huge leaps in the product itself. The huge leaps feel like they're happening kind of around the product. But to me, that's still totally fascinating and interesting because it's changing our relationship to the car itself.
But do you think so? Going back to like the story aspect of it, right? If you look at like the way that I look at automobiles, right, and we get press cars and all the other stuff, and honestly, they're fine. I couldn't tell you the last press car that I've driven that I'm like, I would absolutely spend my money on that. Right? Unless it's some kind of crazy Porsche. And even then I'm like, you know what I mean? It seems that every company, and I've said this before, but take whatever company, take Ford, take Chevrolet, take Acura, take whatever, pick your genre, pick your compact, pick your CUV, pick your SUV. They're literally exactly the same vehicle with a different jelly bean on top of them with the exact same bullshit technology that every other car has. There are no standout differentiators in there anymore where people can go, oh my God, this is so much better. You know what? It's not better.
Well,
they're almost exactly the same. They're a little different.
Yeah. Everything is sort of, you know, perfected. You know, there used to be wild swings in, you know, vehicle dynamics from company to company. You know, like a Saab really felt like a Saab.
Yeah, right.
Like a really shitty car. And a BMW felt like a BMW. Nothing else felt like that. Right. A Porsche felt like a Porsche, and everybody had the same parts. You know what I mean? Everybody had access to the same metals, but they just put it together differently, and it was reflective of a kind of philosophy. You know, like a Saab had a philosophy. agree with it or don't agree with it, it had a personality. It was very, very vivid. And a Corvette had, you know, a really, really, you know, Corvettes adapted through the years, and they went from these very kind of lightly engineered things to like insane exotic beaters, but they were always sort of in step with
Right.
the time, and they had their own thing. And now it's like the benchmarking is so insane, the research is so insane, people are so risk averse that there's tremendous regression to the mean. And I think, you know, if we're being honest here, Mike and I are kind of responsible for some of that, because we're always posting like who got to 60 1/10 quicker, and you know, who went around VIR, you know, half a second quicker, or half a minute quicker, I should say. And so those things are like benchmarks that the industry uses, 0 to 60 times as you know, recorded by the car magazines, to say that they're better than somebody else. And I think it's led to a lot of homogeneity in the car business. Everything's got every sedan had a 15 cubic inch trunk, or cubic foot trunk. I'm sorry.
Exactly.
You know, every EV gets to 60 in 3.7 seconds. And that's totally amazing. But like, EVs have even less personality. There's no engine, you know.
I was going to say though, but you know, there are some, you know, there's always little niches that crop up, and one of the bright spots would probably be EVs, would be the Kia EV6 and the Hyundai Ioniq, which are the same car underneath and totally different. I haven't driven them, so I don't know how, you know, the tuning is probably minuscule that, you know, the average driver isn't really going to know.
Yeah.
But because all these other things have sort of reached this singularity endpoint of, you know, everybody's going for the same dynamics and the same feel and the same refinement and the same acceleration. At some point, automakers look at stuff like the Wrangler, which is, you know, by most accounts drives terribly and like is objectively bad at the basic mission
except
of transporting you as a car, which isn't to say it's not, you know, it doesn't have appeal. I'm just saying, like, for your use case, you know, not really a solution, but look at it sell. And so
it has personality.
The Hyundai Ioniq, the Hyundai might seem like a totally different thing, but it has personality. And
it's like 8-bit Delta Integrale, right? You know, and I think they went for that. And there are very few cars that have that kind of really vivid personality. And S-Class is one of them. Nothing feels like an S-Class. Nothing rides like. Wrangler is one of them. G-Wagon is one of them. Miata is one of them. And nobody's really kind of replicated what a 911 feels like. Even as much as Porsche has kind of moved away from the earliest sort of feel profile of it. And
do you think because the manufacturers have done that, do you think because it's become so I don't want to say the word boring, but just it's such a non-inspiring time. Some things are, there's no question about it. But because most cars now look the same, perform the same, whether it's an EV or a petrol powered or a hybrid, whatever the case is, do you think that's affected the individual purchases? So for instance, when you were in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, right? Every car, you knew what that, if you saw a Corvette, there was no mistaking it for anything but a Corvette. A Cuda, nothing ever came close, right? If a Mustang, you knew it was a Mustang. Trans Am, what else could it be but a Trans, right? They had such distinct personalities. And because of that, the buyers were so distinctive. You knew, you could tell a lot from a person by looking at what, like, I know, like if I see a lifted dually with a pair of truck nuts hanging off the back,
what that is.
I know exactly who's driving that. I know exactly where they live, what their spouse looks like, and how much money they make, you know? And it's like, you don't want to stereotype, but you do because it's funny, right?
Well, yeah, exactly.
But to the cars today, do you think that they've stopped people from kind of going down a more individualistic road, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, on the one hand, we still are what we drive, you know, like if emotion wasn't a factor in what we drive, we'd all have beige minivans, you know. That's just the thing that makes the most sense for most people. A pickup truck doesn't really make a ton of sense for a lot of people. But I also think, Mike, that like our relationship to ownership has changed. You know, we had used to own cars for a very, very long time, and it didn't change. I mean, look at like the R107 SL, right? That thing ran for like, I don't know, 17 years. The 928 Porsche ran for 18 years.
That's right.
And you're like, shit, man. Yeah, it evolved and it changed and it put new engines in it. But, you know, those things stuck around for a very, very long time. And people owned them for a long time. Now, people don't own cars, they lease them. And part of that is to stay up on technology and safety, because we're in this moment where safety is evolving so quickly. But I think it divorces us a little bit from, you know, our bond with the car, and we don't bond in the same way. Like, you know, your old cars, you bond with them, you know, every inch of them, and you fix them on the fly, you know, and shit goes wrong. You know, the combination of this new ownership environment, and we're moving toward one where like maybe we're not going to own cars at all in 20 years, and we're just going to rent them by use, you know. That combined with the utter bulletproof reliability and predictability of these things, it sort of severs the bond a little bit, you know. It requires less of you, both in terms of money and time and anguish. And
so how does that change the story and the narrative of the automobile going forward? And specifically to the story, right? Because all the best automotive stories that I have is when shit just broke, right? Or like I blew something up, or it didn't work, or I, you know, it was 2 o'clock in the morning. I was on the side of I-5 changing spark plugs because they fouled it. Like, at what point did the story start to go away?
I know, when they become appliances. But luckily, we have people like Jay Lamb who say, you know what? Come here with your $500 piece of shit and race it for 24 hours. You know what I mean?
Right.
There's always going to be some countervailing, you know, spirit to that. And old cars, I think, are always going to be here with us.
So I have to ask, what do you have in your garage that you still look at, that, or what cars still excite you? And I'll go so far as to say what old cars, what new cars. And I've got a couple more questions. And Mike, this is for you too.
The old cars that excite me are the ones that really do express that philosophy of what their makers were trying to do. So old long hood air-cooled 911s, the earlier cars that are so light, and you know, they don't have a lot of power, but they just feel so explosive, and the way they come out of corners is incredible. You know, I do have a 107 that I really like, because it's so anti kind of every new fangled notion of performance. You know, that is such a cruiser. But you know, the old cars that excite me are obviously, you know, like the front engine V12 Ferraris. I just can't get enough of those things, man. And I'm sorry that I sound like a Euro brat and everything, but something about a small displacement V12, there's nothing that sounds like that, and nothing that delivers power like that. And it's just so buttery smooth and insane. But I'm also a homer, and like, I really want a Gen 2 Camaro. I really want a split bumper Z28.
I had one. I had a 70.
Well, tell me about it.
It was, well, mine was kind of a shitbox. I bought my car in pieces off a dude in Staten Island when I lived in Queens, and I found it online. And
dude, that is a fucking awesome Staten Island car.
Oh, it was the best. It was the greatest thing in the world. And I got there, and he said, needs some work, but runs. It needs some work, meant in pieces, right? So there was no headlights, no anything. I ended up paying the AAA guy. I dumped him $100 to get it back to Queens for me, and I proceeded to build it in my one-car garage in the back of an alley in Astoria, Queens. You know, but you know what? It was a 4-speed. It had a 383 in it. It had enough Bondo in the quarters that you could surf down them. But it was a bruiser. It was a Queens bruiser. It was a light to light with 410 gears that you would just rip the back tires off of.
Oh my God. Perfect.
It was a neighborhood car.
Yeah, totally.
That's what it was. It was brilliant. It sucked at everything except making you smile.
Going straight down one block.
That's it.
That's
It was
what
good
it's
at.
for.
Yeah, so I would recommend buying one immediately. Absolutely.
No, I think they're just incredible. And the thing is, I don't want cars that are too good. I don't want to be afraid to drive something because I'm afraid to get a ding or a dent or a paint chip or anything like that. I had a philosophy for a while where the most I would ever spend on an old car was $2,500, because like that was almost enough to get a decent car.
Yeah.
Like a good go to work car, as Wendler calls it, Andy Wendler. But the thing about it is, like, if it strands you and it's just done, if it windows a block, you don't care. You're just gonna move on to the next one. You know what I mean? $2,500. It's like, okay, that's enough to get me something decent, but I'm really not gonna sweat it if it just self-implodes.
What you just said, if it windows a block, right? We know what that means. But in 15 years, is a 22-year-old or a 25-year-old gonna know what that means? Are they gonna have any clue what that means?
No. I mean, you can't work on cars now. And there will not, well, there probably will be engines, but like, I have an M3 competition sitting in my driveway. Awesome car, amazing car. Okay, I even like the front end of it now. It's even grown with me.
It's a big statement. Okay,
try working on it. Who can work on that thing? You could change a tire, but everything is totally automated, computerized, and you got to plug it into a machine at the dealer and tells you what's wrong with it.
I was gonna disagree with you, and then I defeated my own argument in my head, which was, I think if you, I disagree in principle, because the electronic stuff is great if you have again, if you have the right tools. It tells you exactly what's wrong. And I think if you look at like my Eurovan 2001, people looked at that and they're like, oh, it's a front drive. They ruined they ruined the VW van. This is VW sort of homogenizing things. Now it's got a ton of character. So there's a certain amount of, like, when cars get older and you take off that objective veneer of, is this the best 0 to 60 time or whatever, and you're just driving them for the character, that brings them back. And I think that's going to continue happening through time. If you dig into stuff from 2010 now, it's got some character, or people are diving into like the horrible hell of repairing them. But the counter argument is the Phaeton, right? Like, that's the worst example, but the M3 might be like it too. And the one I always remember is the Cadillac twin turbo V6. The injectors are like below all of this stuff. You have to take the whole top of the engine. If your injectors go bad, you just have to dig in so deep that it's not worth it. And again, the Phaeton being the worst example, where you have to do this like 2-hour procedure to get in service position. So yeah, for the most part, I guess I agree with you. But at the same time, you see people on social media and on YouTube, like, that have somehow adopted like a 2000 Sentra, and you're like, why would you do that? But then you start looking at it and you're like,
that's a cool car.
They love it.
No, I mean, there is this kind of rosy haze that we apply to all these old cars, and you see it in the collector market, right? Everybody wants what they can now afford, but they want it in high school. So everything tracks sort of like 25, 30 years later. You saw it with Supras and those FD RX-7s and Nissan 300Zs, ZXs, I should say, and BMW E30s and stuff like that, but those were really good cars. I mean, there was, I don't want to say that there was a peak, but like,
they were good.
Late 90s, early 2000s, pretty darn good.
They were good, man. Like late 80s BMWs and Porsches and stuff. There's still, I remember we used to have a 944S. I think it was an 87.
Awesome car.
And I still remember, like, just the door. You close that door and it was a bang fall.
I know.
Porsche doors don't sound like that anymore. No, they just don't. Mercedes, like W123, they don't sound like that. And there's something about that. It feels like it's made out of a solid block of granite that I think most people will never understand, which is why those cars, to see those with 400,000 miles on them is not uncommon. In fact, a buddy of mine just bought one of the first E-Class, one of the first E55s. It has 498,000 miles.
Crazy, right?
498,000. That's so much.
That's like around the world
many
20 times. And I had a 123. Yeah, a 123 and a 124, but I had a 123 that had 300,000 miles on it, and I bought it for $2,500, and the paint was still great on it, and the trim was still amazing, and like you could tell, like, and Audi guys talk about this all the time, like, oh, we were so jealous of the Mercedes trim. Like, we would just stick an aluminum piece into like a steel thing without any washer and just let the thing corrode. And like the engineering on that trim on the Mercedes is insane,
crazy,
right?
Crazy.
Again, that was their philosophy, and they've even come closer they've even regressed toward the mean. And now, like, yeah, AMGs do have their own character, but they're really, I mean, you put like an M5 up against an E63, and those are very similar feeling cars.
Yeah, right. So let me ask you, where do you see, or where do you want to see automotive media and storytelling go? Do you feel like and I know that's a big question, but you've kind of seen it come full circle, right? From the print days and reading some of the best authors and journalists that ever were, right? To going into video and blogs and forums and YouTube and this and that, to now the landscape is changing a little bit more.
Yeah.
What facet do you think needs to make some kind of a comeback into the automotive world?
I think, the earliest, the Brock Yateses and the Larry Griffins and the John Phillips and the David E's and the Gene Lindemut's, they were able to relate to people and to make the stuff relatable. And it wasn't so inside baseball, it wasn't just a snake eating its tail, you know what I mean? And I think we get so involved in this meaningless minutia that we miss the bigger story.
Yeah.
And not to plug my podcast here, but that's what I'm trying to do, like tell these human cultural stories about cars that are important and why they're important and like what they mean, not just what they are.
What is the podcast?
The podcast is called Car Show, and it's a partnership with Pushkin Industries that does revisionist history from Malcolm Gladwell. It does Rick Rubin's Broken Record. It does Michael Lewis's Against the Rules. These are just, such an incredible shows, incredible team of people and producers behind all these shows, bringing them to life. So the idea was like, let's try to get some people who might not be into cars to think about them differently, to think about car criticism as like a real form of criticism, like a record review or a movie review, and to make it real or relatable to people's lives. And one of the episodes we have is about first cars. Like, they're all sort of docu-style, but like I interviewed Rob Corddry and Lake Bell and talking about their first cars. And like, in some ways, our first cars are our most important cars, the most important cars we'll have. And Mike, what was your first car?
Mine?
Yeah.
Mine was a 1981 Mercury Capri that my Aunt Christine gave to me.
Okay.
And I'll never forget it. It was royal blue. It had 4 mismatched tires. 2 of the 4 headlights worked. Had an AM radio with a center dash speaker that was blown, that I didn't care because I ended up putting a $250 stereo through a blown center speaker in it anyway. It was a New York car, so it had rust. And about 2 months after she gave it to me, I completely wrapped it around a pole. And that was my first car.
And you learned about tires.
And I learned about tires, and I learned about being terrible behind the wheel and being like, I should probably improve on this. I learned about being terrified that all my high school friends that were in the car with me were going to sue me and sue my dad. Because at that time, you didn't think about that. You just thought about, this is a really twisty road and I can go down it really fast. You don't think about trees. You don't think about deers. You don't think about guardrails. You don't think about, maybe I could die. Right? You think about that when you go home and your dad looks at you and he's like, where's your car?
Well, it's down.
That's
It's
a
down in the
terrifying thing. Terrifying. And God bless Pop, if you're listening. I will never forget the fact that I'm still walking. So thank you for that. But yeah, it's one of the, but I'll never forget that car. And it was a proper shit box. Make no mistake, but it was my shit box.
Right. No, it's part of your personality. It's part of your story. I mean,
You know, what about you guys?
Mike, you had, I know very early on you had a Gen 4 Camaro, right?
Yeah, I still have that Camaro.
He still has it.
Yeah, but I was gonna say I have a lot of answers because the Camaro kind of counts, like the 86 or the 88 Camry.
Well, no,
the
you
first
can
car I
only have
bought.
one first car. You can only have one first car.
I mean, the first car I drove was the hand-me-down 1986 Chevy Beretta that my mom had, and
Yes.
it was, you know, I grew up in the middle of Michigan, so it was like that was everything we knew. It was like, you know, half of the kids that got cars in high school had a Grand Am because they were made in town.
Hockey car.
And yeah, yeah, the Beretta was yeah, it fit into the like I play hockey and but it was the one thing I remember about it, it was a program car. Like my parents got it like right when the Beretta was new, and it had I never see this anymore. It had like the full stereo with like a 5-bar EQ, like tiny little chrome buttons all over
Looks
it.
good at
Yeah,
night.
that's rad. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's rad.
And,
Well, I have a
yeah.
Beretta adjacent story. When
Go
I
ahead.
was getting my first car, I was very lucky. My dad was rolling in it, and he's like, "I'm going to buy you your first car." So he's like, "We're going to get you a Beretta," and I'm like, "No fucking way!" Everybody at school drives a Beretta, and I hate those kids. And Dad, we're going to drive a Golf. We're going to go to Wood Motors on 8 Mile, and we're going to drive a Golf and a GTI, and I'm going to show you what real automotive performance is all about. And he's like, "Okay, we'll see. And he drove the Golf, and he's like, "Yeah, this is really good. I feel better with you in this thing than with you in the Beretta. I feel like the brakes are better. I feel like the steering is better. I feel like,
Because it was.
it was exactly." So that was my first car, and I kind of like, I was a total ingrate and kind of, fought my dad on it, but he saw the light. I was a car nerd back then. I was a car snob.
That's all right. So then let me ask you this. We've all owned, I'm sure, I don't know how many cars. What's your favorite? The favorite car that you've owned or still own, what is it? Oof. I'm gonna go Mike first.
I mean, it's really hard. I think we've gone over this in the podcast.
We have.
I throw,
But I don't know what Eddie's is.
I throw an honorable mention to the Roadmaster, but I think
The Roadmaster.
and I hate myself for not saying the Honda Beat because I like love it. Like it is, somehow I have this irrational emotional connection to it. But the favorite car, honestly, is the Alpha. It's like, it looks cool. It's an 87 Alfa Romeo Spider. It looks cool. It's beautiful. It has all these flaws that make it charming. Like it is the stereotypical picture of Italy in my head, where it's like, it's beautiful. It's got a bunch of potential. Some of it probably doesn't work as well as it was meant to, but somehow everything comes together and you just love it for it. And there's like, it's sitting outside at a cafe, like sipping on a coffee. It's like, this thing is not in a hurry. Like it'll play the part if you need it to, and you can hop it up if you want to tune it. Like you could, there are, like, that's the one though. It's like every time I'm,
what a fabulous explanation.
Every time I'm driving in it, you can't help but love it.
It's the embodiment of the Italian way of life. Like everything seems chaotic and nothing seems like it's gonna work, but somehow it all comes together, like you said, and it's just a totally piquant experience. It's La Dolce Vita, right?
Exactly.
So Eddie, what do you got?
Okay, this one totally broke my heart. I love this car. I bought a Porsche 356 convertible D, which was essentially 1958, and it was the Speedster with windows, and they called it the Roadster. So it was basically an A, but they called it a D because it was, the D stood for Drow's body, and Drow's made the Speedster body.
Okay.
That car actually had the key on the right-hand side of the wheel, not the left. It didn't have the Le Mans key. And when I saw it, I'm like, is this a real Porsche? It doesn't have the key on the left. And then I realized that Speedsters didn't either. And those two Porsche models had the key on the right. And that's not why I love the car. I love the car because it had 60 horsepower and it was oversteering all the time. Okay. It was never was the wheel straight. It was always like just so much fun to get out of shape. And I just loved that car. And it was so like the performance was so accessible. The gap between that car and the M3 in my driveway is like on a public road, I can never get the M3 unstuck. On a public road in the 356, I was always slipping and sliding. And it was like ice school, it was amazing. So the reason it broke my heart is I bought it for 25 grand, which was a lot of money to me at the time. I had to cash out like some position in a storage locker that I should have kept. And I really wanted this car. And then I sold it to my friend Larry for 25 grand, thinking like, oh God, I got my money out of it. Thank God, because I needed the money. And then like I turn around 4 years later and it's $250,000. And I'm like, fuck.
Oh.
And that is what made me, Mike, to bring it full circle. That's what made me say never again $2,500 cars for me here on out. Of course, I broke that rule, but a $2,500 car will never break your heart.
That's fantastic. That is fantastic. Well, guys, that was a really quick hour. Eddie, you're definitely coming back because this has been.
Oh, I want to, man. I want
way too much fun. This has been rad.
I gotta have you guys on our show. And
I will go on record saying this is absolutely. We've done 100 shows. This is one of my favorite shows that we've had, and it's always just such a treat. I mean, Mike and I have conversations all the time, but to bring you in to have it's just so fun when a conversation is easy and everybody's like, I could totally understand what you're talking about. I mean, for the listeners, I hope you can understand. I mean, it's still, it's still fun, but this is great. So now let me ask you this: for social, for everything that you're doing, where can everybody find you if they want to get in touch with Eddie Alterman? Where are you?
Go check out the podcast on Apple or iHeart or Spotify. Really proud of what we were able to create there, and maybe it's sort of like a new take on cars, and hopefully it does well. I'm not on the Twitter. I'm not on there.
On the Twitter.
But I'm on the Instagram, and because I'm an old man, I'm on the Facebooks. So I'm around.
That is fantastic. Mike, any enders or what?
No, I mean, $2,500 car, that really sealed it.
I think we might have to do that. I think we might have to buy. So all right, one quick thing. We're going to have to do some kind of story in this. I think we each need to buy a $2,500 car. And listen, the concept's been done. People have bought them, driven across the country. We need to do something interesting with $2,500 cars.
I agree. I'm going to think about it. And
think about this,
Mike.
Think about this. So, ladies and gentlemen, everyone out there, thank you for tuning into another episode of the Hemmings Hot Rod BBQ podcast. If you want your $2,500 car, Hemmings has classifieds. We've got like 25,000 cars on there. They're probably not $2,500. But if you have more than that, go and look and buy one for $25,000. We're happy with that. Also, go check out the auction. We've got a bunch of wicked cars at the Hemmings auction. So, everyone, thank you. Eddie, thank you. Mike, thank you. And we'll see everybody next time on the Hemmings Hot Rod BBQ podcast.
Thanks so much. This is great.
Thanks for listening, folks. And again, please subscribe to the Hot Rod BBQ podcast. If you're on Spotify, check us out there. Subscribe to it on iTunes. And if you are going to go to YouTube, make sure you go to the Hot Rod BBQ podcast and hit that subscribe button. And we'll come to you every week.